Good evening and welcome to The Journey Home. My name is Marcus Grodi, your host for this live program that I have the great privilege of hosting each week, introducing to you men and women who, because of their great love for Jesus Christ, were brought home to the Catholic Church, or in our guest's case tonight, brought to a deeper commitment to his childhood faith. Tonight's guest is Dr. Anthony Rizzi. And in some sense, I'm not even sure how to begin, because tonight's show, Dr. Rizzi is a very special person. And of course, I say that about every one of my guests every week, but Anthony's pretty slick here. He's a physicist, and he is the founder and director of the Institute for Advanced Physics. He got his undergraduate degree at MIT, master's at University of Colorado, PhD at Princeton. Let me read you this little paragraph to describe the uniqueness of Dr. Rizzi. Since Einstein first conceived general relativity over 80 years ago, physicists have sought a definition for angular momentum in general relativity. The point being that there are even questions about the theory that Einstein himself couldn't answer until this day. There were certain questions of the general theory of relativity that physicists could not answer, and weren't even sure they could come up with a clear answer. No satisfactory definition of angular momentum had been given until 1997. Dr. Rizzi gave the first such definition, thereby gaining worldwide recognition for his work in theoretical physics. That's very significant, and I'm excited to have him as a guest tonight. We had a good time talking about science during the afternoon. That's a bit of my past. I have to keep up on the shelf because of all the other things that I do. But tonight, as we talked about what would be the theme, as he talked about his journey, because he emphasizes very much the importance of our faith and the importance of philosophy behind having a good physics, to having a solid, faithful science. I went to pose a theme for him, and I think I took him off guard. I thought that the theme for tonight ought to be the good life. The good life. And of course, when we mention that, the first thing that comes to your mind is probably some TV commercial with a guy holding a canned beverage and kicking back and relaxing and making lots of money, being happy. But the issue is our understanding of what is good and what is true and what is right. And if we don't get that correct, if our understanding of what is good and what is right and what is straight is skewed, then all of our decisions based on our misunderstandings become even more and more skewed. And Dr. Rizzi points out that that's the problem of our world and our sciences today. Because without the foundation, we end up getting skewed. Let me give you a quick example. I don't want to take too much time, but I'm trying to think of a way of bringing this down to even old fogies like me can understand. And the reality is that in a very general sense, you and I as human beings are basically a combination of, let's say, four things. Our genetics, what we inherited from our mother and father and Aunt Tilly. Number two, our environment, where we're brought up and all the influences there. The number three is our soul, is that character that we were given at conception. And on top of that, number four would be our will, our freedom to choose to respond to our genetics, to our environment, or to what our conscience is teaching us. So we have that combination. And you recognize that, therefore, if we get those four in a misunderstood way out of balance, let's say, for example, as happened so much in the last century, an emphasis on environment as what shapes a human being, forgetting the reality of the soul. And so they see the answer to our problems as education, trying to shape the environment, either with fear, control, or power, or politics. Or there were those that emphasize genetics is the most important thing, sometimes denying the reality of the soul. So in other words, if a person has a bad behavior, it's their genetics. Or we have those that deny the freedom of the will. We have no freedom to choose what's right or wrong. I can't help it. That's just the way I was made or the way I was evolved. And so you can see that if they're out of balance, we end up with a wrong view of humanity. And you can see that, therefore, we can use science as the wrong answer, trying to provide an answer for problems that we encounter. That's kind of a basis for what we mean by an understanding of what is the good life, what is true. And so Dr. Rizzi would talk a bit about that tonight, as well as his own spiritual journey. Remember, you're an important part of this program. So if you have a question for Dr. Rizzi, give us a call at 1-800-221-9460, or you can send us an email at journeyhome, one word, at EWTN.com. Anthony, welcome to the Journey Home. Sorry for the long introduction. I took half the program with that. Quickly, though, you're presently the founder and director of the Institute for Advanced Physics. You spent a little bit of time at Caltech before that?
Yeah, actually, a little over 3 years as a senior scientist getting this gravity wave detector in Louisiana built. It's a one-of-a-kind, actually two-of-a-kind detector designed to be the first to detect gravity waves. They've never been directly detected before, and so it's a big thing.
Use body surfing, or?
No, it's a 3-mile-long detector that is made of high technology. So high technology, it wasn't until very recently that we actually could do this.
Well, gravity waves is really an issue that is fairly new in terms of being focused in study in physics, right?
Yes, the experimental general relativity is a very new field.
All right, good. Well, obviously we we don't want to scratch the surface even on that. But let's begin, as we always do, because time flies so fast. Start with giving a bit of a summary of your early spiritual journey.
Well, you know, I think probably should start with my childhood, and I come from a very good Catholic family that, you know, my mother is just really the source of my formation, as mothers tend to be. And she made sure we did what was right. She wasn't going to let us. There was 8 of us all together, and she kept every one of us in line, letting us know what was right, and keeping the devotions in order. And of course, my father was there running the family as well. But we're all close knit family because there's 8 of us within 4.5 years. And people usually say, "How can that happen?" Well, the way it happens is the 2 sets of twins. So, but in any case, so I had this really strong Catholic formation, but having grown up in the post-Vatican II church, as you know, and as other people in the audience know, there was a sort of dearth in the intellectual life that happened after Vatican II, where from the pulpit and within the Mass, there was sort of drained a lot of the intellectual element of the faith. So I was not aware of the depth of the faith and the intellectual depth.
You had a good modeling of it at home.
I have a good modeling of it at home.
But in terms of the catechesis and
in terms of the catechesis and the training, in particular in my case, I was given the ability I was in public schools, and I was given the ability to go at my own pace. And so I was quickly outside the regular curriculum and doing college level stuff by the time I was in junior high, in most all the secular subjects. Particularly, I was interested in the sciences and the math. And so as my secular education increased, of course, the secular education comes with its own sort of religious, I would say anti-religious from our point of view, but it has its own secular humanist sort of gospel that it preaches. And I was seeing one of the things they were saying is, religion is for the weak-minded, only those that don't think. And when I turned around over my shoulder and I looked what was being said at Mass and what I was seeing of the church visually, it seemed to be true. But having this solid background from my family, I know I could see the goodness there, and I could see at one level, but my mind, which is the end what leads you, knowledge precedes love. And so I was starting to think, well, maybe I'm mistaken. And I started questioning, and it got deeper as I got more and more and further into the study of the mathematics. The mathematics and the physics were teaching me things that just didn't square with the faith. And when I look back on it, I can see the reason. We'll talk about it later, but because I don't want to make anybody think that they shouldn't go into physics. I'm hoping to get Catholics into physics. But that was leading me. An example that I use is that, for example, at the end of each chapter of my math book that was very, very good for the math had a biography, and one of them was on Blaise Pascal. And they happened to include this thing that, he was this great physicist and mathematician, and then he got religion. And well, isn't it too bad? Because what would he have done if he wouldn't have done that? So my mind was starting to wonder, is it even true? Does God exist? And these questions were entering my mind.
I'm wondering, because you were in, I would call the hyper-accelerated program in that sense. I mean, you were able to your teachers allowed you to progress according to your own pace, that even in that sense you were confronted with some of the ideas that therefore normally would have been presented to children who were 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, but you were being approached at what age? I mean, 12 and 13.
Yeah, earlier, much earlier, right. So I was digesting things, but you know, right, that's right, the slant was very much
I think that's interesting even in that case for you personally, trying to deal with, yes, you have the seeds of your family faith that were planted there, but you were absent the solid catechesis that you would have normally, hopefully gotten in their church environment that wasn't there. But you were getting not only just a regular dose, but a double, triple dose of all of that at an early age.
Yeah, there was a real imbalance that, but I think everyone in that retrospect, we look back on it, we didn't know what was happening to us. My parents had no idea. Before Vatican II, people were able to trust their priests. What their priest said was trustworthy, what the bishop said was trustworthy. And so they really, at that point, we didn't know what was going on, and so we didn't even know enough to say, well, look, we have to go deeper. We have to look behind the facade.
So many things were changing.
So many things were changing so quickly.
In the church, we're
yes,
just changing so much.
So
And the environment, I mean, the 60s was...
the 60s, a cultural environment,
60s, 70s. That would have been in the 70s for you, right?
That would have been in the 70s. I graduated from high school in 78. You know, in CCD, we did things like sing sort of minor melody songs and make collages and talk about love, not war, and you know, and you know, the things on the front of our Scholastic magazine, it said "Make love, not war," and so there was the sexual message in there. And
can you still macrame from all those trees?
I think I've lost it markedly.
Okay, our theme is the good life. You know, you were on a trajectory there because of what you, on the one hand, what you had received from your family, but what you didn't receive in your catechesis. We want to point fingers in that sense, but also strongly what you were getting in your secular environment.
Right.
Well, how did you understand the trajectory of the good life that you were being taught? Or how, if I were to ask you that question back then, I mean, how would you have understood it?
Well, I would have, back then, I would have understood that the good life was what my parents had raised me and what my life with my brothers and sisters. That was, to me, I was clear that that's what was good. Okay. The things that I, you know, saw of the world at that time were in the light of that, so they looked, in retrospect, much better than they were. And so I would say the good life was what I see it is now. Right. It's just that my mind...
So you saw it?
I saw it in one way, but in another way, when I was consciously trying to understand it, my formation, my habitual formation of my intellect was in this science-oriented way that excluded and also said these things like what I mentioned about Pascal, that minimized and said, and put the faith in a category as well. If that's the fantasy you want to have, you can have it.
Would you say at that point, even though you had this strong image of your family, would you have seen at least a part of you as being drawn into the direction in which you see so many scientists heading today?
Yeah, I mean, there's
like describe what that would have been potentially if you'd gone in that direction.
Well, the fascination is that physics is so powerful. In particular, since I'm a physicist, I'll narrow the question down to that area. And the mathematics is there's so much intellectual joy you can get in seeing the beauty in the mathematics, and the beauty, and beauty that, of course, in the end comes from God, because all things have their source in God. But that you can get hung up and mistake the creature for the creator, and I could see myself getting sucked into both the beauty of the equations and the sweeping nature of that. And you know, that St. Thomas says that mathematics is connatural to man, and that's because it allows you to use your imagination and your reason. And I could see, you know, the attraction to that. It was very powerful because you get to use your humanity in a way where it's very resonant with it.
I think I read somewhere, and I'm sure you can correct me on this, is that, for example, when Einstein put together that wonderful theorem E equals mc squared, there was a beauty to that.
Yeah.
Almost to the point where someone could see in that the goodness there.
Yeah. Because
it was an equation that was the simplicity of it.
Yeah, Einstein once said about general relativity, the theory that you talked about earlier in mentioning my discovery, that if God didn't make it, he should have,
Yeah.
which is, you know, inappropriate in one way, but it shows you the just what you're talking about. These things have their own sorts of integrity.
You can get drawn into, obsessed that the beauty of the formulas, the beauty of the workmanship, the beauty of the theory carries on a goodness of its own, almost then becoming a foundation for an ethic,
right.
a moral.
It really is true. What happens is, and I could see it happening more and more within science, which is the reason that I founded this institute that we'll talk about later, but that the end of science no longer becomes the studying of God's artwork, which is really what it is. It becomes a study of the world for its own sake. You don't do it for an end to glorify God, you do it for an end because it's very interesting and it's fascinating, and science becomes, well, I'm going to make that monster as Frankenstein did because it's an interesting thing to do, not thinking about what that monster might be or what the consequences of doing that and whether in the long run it's a good idea.
You know, it's interesting you give the example of Shelley and Frankenstein and the whole genetic engineering, because you know that whole 20th century that we have horrendous examples of where people become so obsessed with the theory of a science. For example, Darwinianism and Darwinian the influence of shaping a society. And you and I talked earlier about the idea that so much that led to the killing of hundreds of thousands of people in the last century had to do with the idea of purifying a race. It's our responsibility to use our science and our technology to make the better human being. And if we can prevent these people that are flawed from reproducing, then we've made a better gene pool so we can have a better humanity. And they can see the good in that because they become so driven by the theory. And you know, that happens in all avenues of science without that good foundation.
Yeah.
So let's move on. So what is it that slapped you up the side of your face and brought you back to your faith?
Well, you know, it got to a real crisis point where I was like, how can this be? You know, this stuff just doesn't seem to be true. There doesn't seem to be anything hard there. And
you mean in what you had brought up in your family?
In what I had brought up in the family, that's right. It seemed to be that was just a fantasy. And then so many things happened, but two in particular I'd bring up, and that is, I found an old book on the Mass. And this old book had pictures of the traditional Mass and the priest in all his garb, and that just attracted my attention. What is this? And I started reading through it, and it described in very detail what was happening at each point in the Mass. Up to this point, of course, I was, you know, we went to Mass every Sunday, and it was a big part of our lives, but to me it looked like it was a celebration or a meal like it was said to be. And you know, if I had more fun going to the football game or playing football with my buddies and going to, you know, and go and get a Coke and a hot dog afterwards than I would go into this celebration and meal. And so it was starting to look less and less. But this book started to reveal to me that the nature of the Mass was sacrificial, that there was something going on there that was transcendent. And it made me realize that there was something that I had missed. And you know, simultaneously, one of the things I have to say is I did look at my dad and I said, now look, there's a smart man there. He believes this stuff. I must be missing something somewhere. And so, and I should mention a family friend who was very, very faithful Catholic, and he was just a model example. And looking at him made me think, you know, there's something. These things were adding up to saying there's something there. And there's something that's beyond this facade that I'm seeing, that I'm not understanding.
In fact, I want to make sure we point in something so we don't be misunderstood. You were talking about the post-Vatican II church. We don't mean that we don't trust the post-Vatican II church, but you're experiencing sometimes the misinterpretation, the misapplication of Vatican II. And in fact, as you were discovering the true meaning of the Mass, you were seeing this in the Novus Ordo.
That's right, that's right. I neglected to say that. When I read this book, I went back and I said, that's it. I could see it very clearly once I understood what it was, that this is in the Novus Ordo Mass just as much as it was there in the other one. So I saw this, and I started, you know, this helped me appreciate and make better use of the graces in the Mass. There was many things that I think that made it harder to see in the Novus Ordo that wasn't that were more clear in the traditional, but it was definitely there. And so, but as I was saying, that I gradually started seeing that there are these things that I missed, that there's something beyond what I had saw on the surface that bared more study. And the thing that really brought me back was finding St. Thomas Aquinas. And when I found St. Thomas Aquinas,
Did you have any of that in any of your upbringing? Any of your,
no, not at all. I mean, unfortunately, the post-Vatican II Church, again, not the result of the council itself, but the result of the way the council was promulgated and what people did with it, and the imprudences that were done, and the misuses of authority and so on. St. Thomas was kind of not in the picture. You were taught to go back to the fathers, or even if that was mentioned. Yeah. There was something about the intellectual life that wasn't quite up to par in the minds of the people that I was around. But finding St. Thomas, I didn't understand it when I first looked at it, but I did understand enough to say there's something here that I don't know, and it's not what they were telling me over here in the secularist world, that this world of the Catholic faith is not solid. This was solid, and there was something there. And I started reading St. Thomas, and it was really understanding the proofs of God's existence that he laid out, and really seeing that those proofs are incontrovertible. Once understood, there's no way around it. God exists. And that really made me, that was the end of that, as they say. I was no longer, and it was a journey to, as we were talking about earlier, as you say, there's these reconversions, and there was a journey that was completed.
Did this happen when you were in college or before you arrived?
This happened, it started when I was like a senior in high school, junior, senior type time frame in high school, and continued like the first year and second year in college, and then from then it was a continually studying of St. Thomas, and then from...
In fact, it amazes me that it's neat that you're going through this spiritual conversion to Christ. You've had it from childhood, but to really discover that hunger and thirst for Christ in his church, while at the same time you're studying physics at MIT, and then Colorado, and then Princeton, and then working at how was it? Was it a battle all the way through, or was it hand in glove? It was shaping it?
Well, it was, there's so much things in modern science that are more fodder for the philosophy, and seeing those things, and on the one hand was opportunity for questioning, saying what does this mean? But on the other hand, as I understood it, it was more fodder for saying, this is just another example of how true this is. And this is why I ended up writing the book that we'll talk about later. Because
why don't we go right there?
Okay.
Because you're the founder and director of the Institute for Advanced Physics, and you're also, this book is still, it's ready for publication, but we're still working on that. But it's called The Science Before Science, should be out soon. A Guide to Thinking in the 21st Century. The best you can summarize it here. How can we help the people see the need for this philosophy for good science, and therefore that's why we got to have our young people going into physics and science?
The science, the book basically tries to go through and show that what we start with is the physical. Everything that we know comes through the physical world. And the Catholic Church, was one of the reasons as a child that didn't seem to be a problem between the two, is that the Catholic Church is very physical. All the things we do have an intermediary of a priest, or, the sacraments are all physical. But the point is that we get things through our senses. Things that we learn through our senses are the things that we know with certainty, and we can come to a whole bunch of conclusions from there. And St. Thomas does. He proves the existence of God. He proves the existence of the human soul. And those certainties are that from which, there's many more, but those certainties are that from which modern science then builds. And that foundation needs to be laid very solid for the purposes of, if nothing else, to maintain modern science in a place where it won't teeter and fall.
Let's stop there a second. St. Thomas was when?
St. Thomas is about the 1250, 1270.
Okay, and that's why, sadly, we have a whole part of the world that looks back at the Middle Ages as this dark, ignorant, dastardly period. But in reality, I once saw a book published, the grand 13th century, and so all the scientists who were involved in the 13th, the 14th, the 15th, the 16th century, 17th century, what they were building on was this presumption of this system, right?
Yeah. I mean, the thing that people often don't realize or don't make fully conscious is that science came out of the Catholic Church. The home of science is the Catholic Church. Other cultures have not been able to provide the fertile environment. You don't find a Hindu Galileo or one that's an Aztec, or you only find the finally flowering of science within the Catholic Church. And one of the reasons is, one of the most popular quotes during the Middle Ages was from wisdom in the Bible. The most popular Bible quote, I should say, is, "He created things according to measure, number, and weight." Now, there's no better sort of bottom level way to found science than trust in the existence and the reasonableness and the rationality of the world. Building on that, understanding you have a cultural framework from which you can get the confidence to do just what they did. And they built, when Galileo came along, he was building. Matter of fact, some of the things that he says echo almost word for word things that people said in the 1200s. St. Thomas laid a foundation that, I like to compare it to Islam. In Islam, when Islam came to its head and realized what it really thought, science died. When Christianity came to its head and really fertilized its thought in its full completion, and many popes have said this, it's St. Thomas, the philosophy of St. Thomas. Science could just take off like a rocket because that firm foundation was put in place. Now we're talking culturally, not individuals. Individuals can do things outside of the culture because they have a free will, but to really have a science, you need a community.
Quickly, for example, we have, though in modern science, we seem to see a foundation of materialism, scientific mechanization, or relativism, that there really isn't a truth, or that we even have some that can go so far as to say that this stuff really isn't real, it's all just a bunch of air. Where'd we get there? What happened?
Well, what happened is that we ended up with a philosophy that starts in the middle instead of at the beginning. And to start at the beginning, you have to recognize what comes first. And Aristotle, from whom St. Thomas learned so much and actually built on, he gives the example of an arrow. If you shoot an arrow and you're off just a little bit down here, it makes a huge difference by the time you get to the target. And so we start off with a little arrow down here, and by the time we get up here, we're way off. And if we start in the middle and try to progress, if we've got a bad starting point here, then we don't even know how far off we are from the end. And the fact is, we have to come back and recognize that this physics in this broad sense, and that is physics in the sense of the study of the visible world, the visible, sensible world, is the foundation upon which we do everything else. I mean, the apostles, when they saw Christ, they knew him first as a physical being. And when you read the Bible, you know the Bible first as a physical thing. Jesus, our love of Jesus comes from our knowledge of him. And how does our knowledge come? From him speaking and acting in the physical world. That's why he became man. So getting that foundation right and those certainties right is very important in order to build the rest. All the other fields will depend on having a good physics. And if we have a dominant physics that has error in it, what will happen is the fields that then depend on it, from theology to the sciences to whatever else, they will, to their own, to the measure that they're wrong.
So bad philosophy and everything built on.
Bad philosophy will end.
Newman, in his book on the essay on the development of doctrine, Henry Cardinal Newman had this statement, which I've quoted a zillion times on the show: to become deep in history is to cease to be Protestant. And the sad thing is, when I think about so many of the Protestant groups, they kind of begin their history just like you're talking about, like way up here, you know, and they don't know what happened in the first.
Yeah, start at the 1600s.
You know, they kind of start the 16th or the 17th or the 18th or the 1900s. The same would be true then for science.
Yeah. Right, right. I mean, to be deep in history is to cease to believe in scientism, is a good way of saying it. I mean, you can't maintain. I mean, Galileo and Newton both were educated in St. Thomas, in Aristotle, which is effectively St. Thomas. It was in the air, and they in various degrees didn't understand it, and it started a trend whereby we gradually lose all the fullness, and that's what we've got to get that fullness back, because what can happen is that we're being sustained on a cultural sort of inertia right now, and if we lose that, as we lose that inertia, I mean, you can only burn your inheritance money for so long, and then you're out of fuel, and then you get cold. We have to get that foundation back again. We can't fix it from up here. We've got to fix it down at the bottom level physics, the bottom level, we're the source, where our foundation is.
The bottom level of philosophy.
Philosophy, right.
Philosophy.
It's you call it what we now call physics is narrow. It's this part up here, but I'm trying to get the vocabulary back to include what Aristotle would call physics includes what we now narrow. We take philosophy and we stick it over here and say, well, you can study that if you want.
Okay.
In fact, most people, when they hear the word philosophy, they think of a vague, amorphous thing.
Yeah.
But it's actually the beginning of philosophy starts with this study of the physical world, and that really is a part of physics. We've just excluded it. We've piecemealed it apart. We've taken that, put it over there, and that.
And beginning with the assumption that God created it.
Yeah, I'm sorry?
Beginning with we look at the beginning of the physical world, that this was a created image, or you begin it without that?
We begin it without that.
Oh,
You look at that, and then you understand, once you understand that, then you see that being that is contingent, being that is dependent on another, can't exist on its own. So there must be a being that is being in its fullness. And then you come to the conclusion that God exists.
Like Paul says in the first of Romans, couple chapters of Romans, that the evidence of God is there in His creation.
The evidence, that's right. And Paul says it, he says it, and that's the indication of just the fact that you start from that he doesn't say that you're born knowing God. He says, you look out there, then you know Him.
Then you know. All right. Which also connects with that seed that was planted inside of us, the imago Dei, the image of God that's there. I feel we've just scratched the surface. We already time to take a break, so we'll come back in a bit with your questions for Dr. Anthony Rizzi. See you in a bit. Welcome back. My guest for this evening is Dr. Anthony Rizzi, and he's had a chance of giving us your journey of faith. And I sense, I think about so often we'll have guests and their journey involves, being argued in through apologetics or something like that. Really the solid core of your faith was the witness of your folks, your parents, and the seeds that planted there. And it just reminds us of how we should never give up hope, when we do the best we can as parents and plant the seeds of our faith. They need to see it in us. And Lord, forgive us when we fail. Of course, we got to say that to our kids too. Please forgive me if I've failed so many times. But trust that those seeds stay, and then we can continue with prayer to nurture. My guess is, if your parents saw you off wandering, in the valley of despond, that they were keeping you in prayer.
Yeah.
I mean, that was the model of your parents.
Mm-hmm.
But boy, we just scratched the surface on the science and philosophy stuff, and I can guarantee most of the stuff's above my head. So Dr. Rizzi is going to be answering all your questions. I'm just going to sit back and listen. But I do want to remind you that his book, The Science Before Science, I wish it was out now, but it's not, A Guide to Thinking in the 21st Century. Is there any way they can be connected for the future when it comes out?
Right. I think that later on they're going to put up a slide, but in the future they can get it from, right now they can get it from my website, IAP Web. That's Institute for Advanced Physics, iapweb.org. And if you'd like to order the book, there's a place you can read about the book and then pre-order it as well.
Okay. Let's try this email. This comes from CP. Thanks for your email, CP. Dr. Rizzi, how does one pursue knowledge without letting it become a false idol? And this is good. Let me read all the whole. He's got a little bit more here. Also, do you think that questioning equals doubting? You think it is better to question faith in the pursuit of truth than to accept without question all the tenets of faith? Or do you think that questioning leads too easily to disbelief? And I'm going to have the staff keep this email on so I can remember all the questions, because there's some good stuff there.
So read the first question.
Okay, how does one pursue knowledge without letting it become a false idol?
Well, this is the whole thing that you were talking about earlier about the good life, and that is to get your things in order. And when you know the truth, you know what things are, and so you know what the proper order is. And if you know the truth, you know that the end of man is God. Without God, man makes no sense. And so everything has to be ordered towards him. Anything trying to take and put that someplace else is like trying to put the steering wheel in the trunk. It has a proper place, and if you put things in their proper order, if things are done ordinately, and that means in order, then it will not become an idol. It will become the tool that it's meant to be.
Okay. Then he goes on, do you think that questioning equals doubting?
No, I don't, and I think that's a great question because, speaking of Cardinal Henry Newman, he says someplace that 1,000 questions doesn't equal one doubt, which I think is so true because the way that we are made is to learn, and if we're going to learn, we have to ask questions. We're made for truth, and we're made for the love of Jesus, and to love Jesus, we have to know him, and it's just natural for the language of love is to get to know that person. The more you love, the more you want to know, and then in turn, the more you love. So those questions, as Newman says, 1,000 of those questions will not make one doubt. It's the intention and where you're at.
Very good. The intention.
Yes.
Again, back at the core of what you're trying to accomplish. Do you think it's better to question faith in the pursuit of truth than to accept without question all the tenets of faith?
Say it again?
Do you think it is better to question faith in the pursuit of truth than to accept without question all the tenets of faith?
Yeah, so I think that's a related question. That is, you don't question the faith, you question, St. Anselm says, I believe that I may understand. Yeah. And one way of taking that quote, in Latin it actually means I believe in order to understand. But it can also be taken in the way, I believe that I may understand. In other words, faith is required to really have the confidence to go out and understand in the full way that we can. So having the faith is an asset, not a deficit.
Yeah, and that idea of I believe, it's interesting. When I remember seeing that quote long ago, I believe that I might understand. I had this image like that it's like taking a blind leap.
Yeah.
And it isn't.
And no.
When you have the foundation, then your beliefs are built on what's true, and
Right.
so you can feel confident that you're taking a step
Yes.
in the right direction.
That's right.
That's the key. Let's take our first caller, Tom from Missouri. Hello, what's your question for us?
Hello, Marcus. I just want to thank you, first of all, for your program. I really enjoy it.
Thank you.
And my question for Dr. Rizzi is, why does he think so many in the scientific community see a dichotomy between science and religious beliefs?
Thank you very much.
That's a very good question. Tom, I think that's really what is at bottom of all of the problems that we're having, and that is that science has been narrowed down to a very, very thin thread of what it actually is. And this causes lots of problems within the sciences and also without. And that is that science is sort of the head of our culture now. I mean, the scientists are the new high priests. If someone tells you that they've read a scientific study, that Rome has spoken, if I may borrow the phrase and misuse it. And the problem is if science were in its full nature in the right context, having this foundation just right, then it wouldn't be the good conclusions that it comes to. And I want to encourage you young men out there especially to become physicists, because we need good Catholic physicists. And that's why the Institute is founded, is to fill out this bare thread so it includes the full human person, all three of the triad, the philosophical, the moral, and the spiritual. And the philosophical foundations are what we've talked about. If you think, for example, in physics, the field is very it's very mathematical now. The physical world is looked at as mathematical, and we talked earlier how
almost digital.
Almost digital, but we talked earlier how you can look at TV and you can see the anchorman saying things like, "Well, General, how do you factor that into the equation?" And neither of them have probably seen an equation since they were in 8th grade, and they're talking in the language of mathematics. And the thing that happens in physics is that we get the world as quantitative, and we do that very well. But when we come back and try to see what the reality behind the quantitative is, what the reality that fleshes out the quantitative, we don't do it consciously, we do it unconsciously, and this is where the errors creep in. This is where you get people saying quantum mechanics disproves causality. And that there's a recent article in Scientific American that says that there's a multiverse, which means that at every moment we're splitting into an infinite number of people. And those sorts of conclusions come straight from the mathematics. That was in Scientific American, yeah.
Oh, man. You see, what cracks me up and I spent as many years in science as I have spent in theology, and I love it. I miss it in many ways because it is fascinating. But what amazes me is this dichotomy, and it isn't just an ignorance of the faith or maybe a misunderstanding of faith. Sometimes it's just downright stubbornness. Because, I mean, there are some great books out there available at the biggest bookstores, secular bookstores, that disprove in real strong philosophical and scientific arguments the idea of evolution from spontaneous generation that produces life, from spontaneous generation. And they're strong, but then the scientists cannot hear it because that would involve some kind of creator. And you put a creator in an equation, it can't go there. And it's frustrating to see that. So even when the two get close, there are some that will not go there. And I hate to say it, but I knew a professor at a university who was brought up with faith, no longer had it, and he told me that one of the goals of his life in his biology classes was to crack the faith of his students. That was one of his goals, his raison d'etre for teaching.
Yeah.
I mean, that's frustrating. We have to pray for men like that.
But you know, there really is a sense, though, in which these men, you know, there's no doubt that what you're saying is true. There's a will element there, but there's a confusion in the meaning of these things that goes to the root that really you can't find books on. There's the reason that I finally wrote my book is because after 20 years of being a physicist and seeing these problems only get worse as our culture disintegrates around, and these problems have no sort of natural barrier to them, that we needed to have a book that took the sciences, which are a good area of our culture, a good and true area, but they're out of proportion, they're not put in their right light, and so lots of confusions result. And it's very hard to find, as I say, the reason I wrote my book is there's really not another book been written that brings them together and shows people how to get out of the trap. And some of these men, they are convicted of it. I could see myself going that way. I could see myself being pulled, you know, almost against my will, going that direction because the intellectual formation and the power of their thinking didn't match what I was being taught.
Let's take this next email from Ken Haddock. I think that's how you pronounce it. I apologize, Ken, if I'm pronouncing it wrong. In Littleton, Massachusetts. Dear Marcus and Dr. Rizzi, could you recommend a good place to start reading and learning the thoughts and teachings of St. Thomas Aquinas? This seems like something too important to keep away from.
Well, I mean, like I say, I really recommend my book because this is the only place that incorporates the science and the philosophy together. Now, if you really want something now, because the book is not out yet, I would recommend Orthodoxy by Chesterton and Everlasting Man by Chesterton. Okay. And he's, you know, he doesn't hit the points from a science point of view, but nonetheless the answers are in there, and he's just a genius. Chesterton just really hits the nail on the head. The other one I would recommend for St. Thomas himself is Walter Farrell. Has a nice book. He doesn't address the science issues, but he can get you started. And
yeah,
St. Thomas himself is also recommended because he's just, I mean, there's no one to beat St. Thomas.
Yeah, there's a number of authors out there that think, it'll come back to me. He's a convert philosopher out of Boston College.
Peter Kraft.
Peter Kraft has a couple books in which
Ralph McInerney.
And Ralph McInerney are both wonderful Catholic authors who have summarized St. Thomas. I'm sure we can think of others.
I think Ralph McInerney has one called Peeping Thomas.
Okay. That's right. So those are good places to begin. And you might go to the EWTN website also, do a search there, and you probably find some other information on Thomas Aquinas and his teachings. Let's take another email. This comes from Paul. Dear Marcus and guests, Romans chapter 1 and Wisdom 13 speak of a knowledge of God's existence from nature. Does Dr. Rizzi believe there is such a thing as an atheist in good faith?
Well, I mean, I don't think so. I mean, there just doesn't seem, in that, if your intellect is in order, you can't really deny the existence of God. But what does happen is something more convoluted, and that is you don't know who God is, and you deny that. You deny some perception of who you think God is. And I think that's much more...
agnosticism.
It becomes an agnosticism, but for the person, he thinks he's denying God.
Yeah.
He's being denied the thing that's been presented to him as God. And often, unfortunately, from lack of our own understanding as Catholics, sometimes we don't present him in his full glory. Yeah. He's sometimes presented as like the guy that comes in and fixes the broken machine. instead of the creator and the source of it all. And that person, if you deny that person, you're not denying him who is.
And it is sad that we do have Catholics who life are in science, but you don't see their faith very clearly in their work or the connection thereof.
Yeah.
And so but it's an important field for Catholics to be in. I mean, I especially think today in the direction that biology is going with genetics, and that we need good, solid Catholics in those fields to be a brave witness to those issues.
To take the fully human thinking with them into the field, and take that bare thread and take those bare bones and put the flesh back on it, and be a witness to how you do that.
I mean, it's a real sense in which agnosticism, a person can pretty well live in agnosticism and not think that much about God, but to be an active atheist is a religion in itself.
Yeah, that's right.
When you're actively against this faith, and it can truly be an obsession in the other direction.
Right, so that's right.
Here's an email from Dan from Connecticut. Dear Marcus and Dr. Rizzi, over the last several decades I have seen a decline in the number of intellectual Catholics. One is only to look at the modern arts, the state of literature and the theater, philosophy and science to see that most intellectuals are secular in thinking and very anti-Catholic. Why is this? What do you see as a possible remedy to revive the static state of the intellectual Catholic? First, why do you see it happening?
Who's that from?
Comes from Dan in Connecticut.
Dan, thank you much, Dan, for that question. It's a great question. I felt like I must have asked you to do that. No, it's really true. I mean, there has been a lack of intellectual sort of interest among Catholics, and I think it has to do with the way that the sciences have gradually, as you mentioned earlier, there's sort of as happens to Protestants, as they get distance from their roots, they lose more and more the tradition. The analogy in the sciences, as sciences get left behind by Catholics not entering the sciences, they lose more and more of their tradition and their heritage, and it becomes thinned out. And then Catholics get less and less interested in being in that. Orthodox Catholics see the danger to their faith and not being educated in what's right about that, because the sciences have been the real area where there's been positive advances, and one of the few elements in our culture that respects truth, that will say there is truth, are scientists. And so they see the element that can lead them away from the faith, and young men say, well, look, I want my faith, so I'm not going to go into those areas. So as the secularists take them more and more over and destroy this base, the less Catholics are apt to go in. That's why I've actually founded the Institute to actually start from the ground up, so that homeschoolers and college-age kids and as well as PhD students will have a place to go to get a fuller education, so that they can have that 17 years of education that a scientist gets in the full method, not in the secularized method.
Not in just that fine perspective.
Not in that fine perspective, but in the broad perspective.
I think the other thing that maybe with that happens is that it is a constant battle between trying to live out the requirements of our faith while you're in the arena of the world.
Yeah.
And Jesus said, you can't love the world and me. And so there's that tension. And sadly, we see compromise, and then sometimes people downplaying their faith because of their career and their name and all of that, the power and prestige that comes with. I mean, you can gain some pretty strong power and prestige and money in the science world. Yeah. But it involves a difficult life.
Right. Giving up. You have to give up some of the external of the. I mean, you have to. There is because Catholics have left it behind. It's not cool to be Catholic and be a physicist or be a scientist, and there is that struggle.
I mean, I hate to mention this. In fact, if some of the old researchers that I worked with are watching, I apologize. I hope I embarrass anybody, but it's sad when you're working in a lab environment with a bunch of people and you don't have any clue that any of them are Catholic until Ash Wednesday, when they show up with these gray splotches on your forehead. You said, you were a Catholic? I didn't know that. Our life ought to speak Catholicism other than Ash Wednesday. Yeah. We should be able to tell it all the time in our lives, in our ethics, in our morals, as well as the way we work our jobs. Let's take this next email from Ira Levine. Dear Marcus and Dr. Rizzi, Why did it take so long for the church to recognize that it had made a mistake in chastising Galileo for his discoveries?
Well, Ira, that's a good question because it comes up a lot. The fact is that the Galileo case is a very complicated case. It's not simple. There's many issues involved. Part of the thing that Galileo didn't understand was this very base that we're talking about. Even though he was educated as an Aristotelian, he lost a lot of his Aristotelian understanding. And one of the things that was at stake, it's Irene, right?
Yep.
One of the things that was at
Ira,
stake,
yeah.
Ira, I'm sorry. One of the things that was at stake, Ira, was the actual existence of the properties of things. And I recently read a biographer of Galileo who said he thinks, in his opinion, that the controversy was about transubstantiation. And this is an interesting thing because it wasn't about the supernatural aspects of transubstantiation, but he claims it was about the reality of the properties, because and the natural end of the transubstantiation, and that is to say that we believe as Catholics that the real presence of the Eucharist is there despite the reality of the real properties that are maintained of the bread. The bread's still white, it still has the taste of bread, and so on. And what Galileo was denying was that things have properties, which would undo the doctrine of, so his argument was that Galileo was preparing the way to destroy this doctrine. So the church there would be defending, if he's right, the church would be defending the natural. So there's many things in there that are not simple. And the church has not apologized for this defense of the doctrine, just about the particular treatment. And but I should also add that, the Galileo did not prove that the earth goes around the sun. That waited for 200 years later, at which time the church lifted the prohibition. He was a little bit, for one thing, he was a genius. So he could stand on this, as Newton said, he could stand on the shoulders of the giants that came before him and see further, but he didn't have the proof. He had the insight and the ability to see it, but he pushed it beyond what the proof was. So it's a complicated case is the short answer, and it's not as simple as it's painted.
Yeah, that question of trying to rebuild a philosophical foundation when you didn't have it before is really important. Here I am on the other side of the hill, and I didn't have philosophy when I went to high school or college. I was trained in engineering, no philosophy. Even my seminary training as a Protestant involved no training in philosophy because we saw that as just the negative ways of man. We didn't see the value of a true philosophy. Mm-hmm. So, when you haven't had that as a thread, where do you start?
I think that you need to start with thinking about the things you know with certainty, and remember that there are lots of things. We're taught so much about science, even those that are not scientists, that we forget what comes first. And we get in sciences, we get talking about the atom, and we start thinking the atom is the reality, and the table is sort of, we have to now explain the table. But it's the other way around. An atom is a third or fourth level of knowledge that we base on such things as the knowledge of the table. And thinking about, the people at St. Thomas talks about common sense, and common sense is the sort of incoherent action of the intellect that before you've gone to philosophy. So we kind of have this in our gut because we do this sort of natural, spontaneous thinking that figures these things out. And I would say that kind of thinking, just to keep in mind what comes first and what doesn't. Aristotle and St. Thomas say you must start with what is more known and move to what is less known.
Okay. Well, you're a fine example of a man whose love for science brought him back to the faith, and it's neat to see that, in fact, it's an affirmation that the good philosophy of Thomas Aquinas is one that can build the foundation as the church is taught, but for people like myself that came from the outside, it's neat to see that confirmation in a living soul. Thank you very much. I want to remind the audience again of the book, The Science Before Science, A Guide to Thinking in the 21st Century. His website will be available, maybe even other links on the website that might help the folks.
Yeah, there's some links.
In some of these issues, and even about the Institute for Advanced Physics, if any of you are interested. And the bottom line is that we're emphasizing that physics is fun, and we're encouraging good men and women of faith to look at their gifts and to see how they can serve the Lord in the sciences such an important part today. Thank you very much
Thank you,
for
John.
joining us, Anthony. It's a pleasure having you with us. And God bless. I'll see you again next week on The Journey Home.